I see. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th episode. Today, our guest is Professor Frans de Waal, a world-renowned primatologist and author of many interesting books on animal behavior. Today, we are going to focus on his latest work, Different Gender Through the Eyes of Primatologist. What I would like to start with is a recent hot topic, abortion. You mentioned in your books that Netherlands has the lowest rate of abortion, one of them among the lowest rates, and you say that it has to do with sex education starting early 4 years. So what's your general take on this debate, and maybe compare how various cultures see it?
Yeah, I know I'm not going to comment on the debate itself, but if you want to fight abortion, the most efficient way is to give sex education and give free birth control. The Netherlands has the lowest rate of abortion and lowest teenage pregnancy rate in the world. And they have a very different approach to sexuality than in the US. In the US, they try to scare the kids and tell them all sorts of bad things that can happen if you have sex. In the Netherlands, they try to teach them that love needs to be involved and how to prepare for it and what to do and how to prevent pregnancies. And so, yeah, education is very important. It's a much more pragmatic approach, not a moralistic approach. And that's typical, actually, of the Netherlands. That's also how they approached gay marriage and issues like that.
Yeah. But a surprising thing for me is that in USA, also here in Georgia too, most of the people who are against abortion are the same people. There is a big overlap who are against early sex education.
So, yeah, it's a bit strange. I find that very strange. But that demoralizing creates that sort of attitude if you're not practical about things, you know. But it is, of course, a gendered issue in the sense that it affects women more than men, even though I think men are going to be very affected because it are men who cause the pregnancies. And so they are very much involved and they cannot act as if they're not involved. But it is very much a gendered issue. And it shows again how biology needs to be part of the gender discussion always. So that's the message of my book, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, current intellectual atmosphere has to do more with political camps opposing views, with radical social constructivism on one hand and radical role of culture denial on the conservative end of the spectrum. I think your book was exactly what was lacking, you know, a pure ethological analysis of the subject. What I would like to know is, you mentioned the specific brain areas conducted at Dick Swap's Neuroscience Institute, area called bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and there is some data suggesting that it might be involved with gender identity. Could you explain it a bit more clearly?
Yeah, I cannot explain you need to interview Dick Swap if you want to know the neuroscience of this part, you know, but he did post-mortem brain dissection of people who were transgender, who mostly actually trans women, more than trans men, but there are more trans women than trans men. So I cannot comment too much about the neuroscience of it, but the general gist is that transgender identity arises very early in life and is part of your biology. We don't know what it causes it. We don't know if it's genes or hormones, and even the brain data could be questioned in that regard. But we do know that it arises early in life and is nearly irreversible. So, for example, there was a recent study in the US that showed that children who say that they are transgender, so let's say they're born as a boy, but they say they are a girl, 6 years later, they still have exactly the same opinion. There's only 2.5%, that's very low, only 2.5% changes their mind on this. means it's a very persistent view that they have of themselves. And I would argue the same is true for cisgender people. We don't often talk about that, but people who identify with the biological sex they were born with, which is what we call cisgender, they, of course, also that arises very early in life. That very early in life they feel, I'm a boy, I'm a girl. And so the gender identity, whether it's trans or cis, is part of who you are. It is really an immutable part of who you are. The same with sexual orientation. We now accept that, most of us accept that for homosexuality. It arises early in life, and it doesn't change much. And we have seen all these conversion therapies that in the US that have been tried, which have basically no effect, which are cruel in a way. So those are immutable parts of your personality, basically, how you identify and what your orientation is. And so that's also part of biology. And what I argue in my book is that since this is accepted by many people, especially by progressive people, it's accepted that being transgender or being homosexual is part of who you are. We also should accept other things that are associated with gender as potentially biological. That doesn't mean that we know exactly what the biology is, but potentially biological. We need to have a more inclusive view of biology in the gender discussion.
Our closest relatives genetically are bonobos and chimpanzees. But they differ from each other in many crucial ways in terms of how gender identity and sexuality works in these two species. Would you give a sort of general picture of usual life of average bonobo or chimpanzee with curious examples like chimpanzee Donna?
Yeah. So we have two close relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. And people often forget about the bonobos. And that is because the chimpanzee was discovered first. It's better known. And the chimpanzee fits with the ideas of major anthropologists. The anthropologists have the idea that humans are so successful because we are aggressive and warriors and male-dominated, and that's how they look at the human species. And the bonobo doesn't fit in that. And the chimpanzee fits very well because chimpanzees can be very violent also in the wild. I always include the bonobo. Genetically, they're exactly equally close to us as the chimpanzee. They are a much more erotic species. They use a lot more sex in their social life. But I would say humans are a very erotic species too, and we often don't even talk about that, but that's absolutely true. And the bonobo is female dominated, and that bothers some people. But, you know, I think that's actually very interesting. And so in the bonobos, the females are collectively dominant over the males. The females are smaller than males, and so individually they cannot dominate the males, but collectively they do. And so the alpha female usually has a clique of other females around her, and together they run the whole group. Chimpanzees are very male dominated. Every healthy male is dominant over all the females. And they have much more male bonding. The males work together, they are competitive with each other, but they're also very much bonded, and they groom and they travel together, and they defend their territory together, and they can be very violent when they do so. The main source of violence in chimpanzees is violence between groups, not necessarily within the group. That also happens, but between groups. And so they have a very different societies. One is more matriarchal, the other one is more male-dominated. They offer very different visions of us if we compare ourselves with them. And in a gender discussion, it's really, in a way, it's confusing to have them because we don't have a simple picture. We have two quite different close relatives, but it also enriches the discussion, I think. And so, for example, in my discussion of female sexuality, I talk a lot about the bonobos because it's very prominent in them. And the views in biology are very much changing. The way we view female sexuality is changing at the moment.
To what extent is male aggression innate and related to more biological reasons and cultural, or how would you estimate approximately?
Well, males are more violent than females, physically violent. And this is true for all human societies. So you look at the murder statistics of any nation, men are going to do more than women. And it's true for all the primates. Females can get violent, and that sometimes happens, and also happens in humans, of course, but the frequency is lower, and the intensity is often lower. So that's a universal difference in all the primates and in all human societies. And I think if you find that kind of things, you have to pay attention, because then biology is most likely involved. But there is variability, of course, also in human societies. There are human societies where violence is extremely low. It's suppressed in the society, and kids are educated not to fight physically, for example. So even with the trait that I think is clearly biological, there is all this cultural variability. That's so interesting about the human species. And I think the same applies to the other primates. We find increasingly how two groups of the same species may be different in their behavior. And so increasingly, we talk about cultural differences in the primates too. So for example, in the chimpanzees, most of the data on lethal aggression, lethal violence in the wild comes from East Africa chimpanzees. West African chimpanzees do much less of that. And we don't know exactly why that is, but it means that the picture that we have of chimpanzees as very violent is maybe a culturally biased picture, because East Africa was the place where Jane Goodall and the Japanese started their field work. And so we have been very much influenced by that image of the chimpanzee. But if you look at chimpanzees in different parts of Africa, you get a different picture.
You claim that overinflation of concept of gender over sex maybe has something to do with the fact that in English language there is a dual meaning of sex. So for people use like gender when they talk about gender of giraffes, etc.
We use the word gender very freely at the moment in American English. It's used for everything, and it's used even for frogs or dogs or whatever. They all have genders now. And initially, that was not the meaning of gender. The meaning of gender was the cultural expression of your sexual identity. And I usually divide genders not in male and female, but in masculine and feminine. It's how you express yourself, which is culturally variable, which differs between the genders. There's not necessarily two genders. There may be more genders, and everything in between. So gender is a much more flexible concept than sex. Sex is mostly binary, not entirely, but mostly. Gender is much more of a spectrum.
Would you recount few examples of gender identity or in chimps or bonobos not coinciding with natal sex?
Yeah, we had a female named Donna who was clearly born as a female, but very early in her life, I knew her since she was 3 years old. Very early in her life, she wanted to wrestle with me, but also with adult males in her group. And young females don't do much wrestling. It's much more a young male activity, roughhousing and mock fighting. But she loved to do it, and she would invite the adult males in the group, and the alpha male would do it with her, which was also a bit exceptional because he mostly did that with young males. So from a very early age onwards, we thought she was different. We didn't know what it was, but then later, when she reached puberty, which chimpanzees do when they're about 10 or 12, then later she developed into a much more masculine character. She developed the big shoulders and the big hair. The males have a lot more hair than the females the big head. And she liked to display with the males. The males would have intimidation displays, and she would join them. She would go along with that, which females almost never do. So she turned into some sort of male. From a distance, she looked like a male. And she was very well integrated. She was very well accepted in the group. She was peaceful. She was not violent. And we've had males too. I've known many males who, maybe it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 males, who don't play the macho game, who don't want to. They may be big males, but they don't necessarily want to be the dominant male, and they stay out of confrontations. So we have males who don't play the male role very much, and we have females who don't play the female role very much. For example, Donna never had children. Also, she was not attracted to that. So we have individuals who deviate from the typical behavior. And I think in primatology, we have underestimated that, because we like to talk about typical behavior. We have underestimated how many of these individuals there are. There's, of course, also individuals who are more homosexual than heterosexual, but we have that too. So all that gender diversity that we nowadays discuss in human society, we can probably find in the other primates. And I think we have underestimated that.
There are some aspects of sex differences that are obviously apparent, like women being more prone to autoimmune diseases. Different treatments are recommended for different sexes. But what are some of the examples of behavioral sex typical, gender typical behaviors that is universal among bonobos or chimps and humans? Like universal structures.
Yeah. So the main difference you already see very early in life, which is that young females are interested in infants. And if you give them dolls, they're interested in dolls. And these experiments have been done with monkeys, for example. You give them toys like trucks and dolls, and it's the young females who end up having the dolls, which they hold close to them. They put them on their back. They walk around with them. They treat them very gently. The males, they often take the dolls apart to see what's inside. So they're not very caring with the dolls. And infants, for sure, if a young mother comes with a newborn baby, she's going to be surrounded by young females. The young females want to touch the baby and see the baby. The young males are not particularly interested in that. And later, the young females become the babysitters. Not the young males, but the young females become the ones that can be trusted and hold the babies and stuff like that. The young males, they like to wrestle, roughhousing and mock fighting. That's what they do the whole day if they get a chance. And this is also universal in the human species. All the studies that I know of play behavior in human children, the boys wrestle more with each other than the girls. So that's a universal difference. And these two differences, the interest in infants and dolls and the interest in mock fighting, it's not just limited to humans and chimpanzees and bonobos. That's all the primates. You see that in all the primates. It's a massive difference. And it prepares the young ones for their adult lives, because maternal skills need to be learned. They are not inborn. People always speak of the maternal instinct, but it's very hard to raise a child. For example, if you're a big primate like a gorilla, and she sits upside and she has a baby in her lap, how does the baby get to the nipples? How does the baby drink? The mother needs to help the baby. The mother needs to know what to do. And if she doesn't know it, the baby is going to die. And we know from studies in captivity that if you have a gorilla group or a chimp group where you've never had any babies, and all of a sudden a female is pregnant, we know that everything goes wrong. She needs an example. And what the zoos do under these circumstances is they bring in human mothers who nurse their babies in front of the apes to show them how it's done. So maternal skills need to be learned, and the young females are very eager to learn them because they're very interested in infants and in dolls, and that's how they learn that. And the male behavior, well, the males will be involved in more physical fights, and so learning fighting skills is very important for them. But it's also important for them to learn how to control their physical strengths, how to learn to win and to lose, and how you hurt others and how you don't hurt others, what is still fun and what is not fun. And so they need to learn, because they are the stronger sex, they need to learn to restrain themselves and to have control over their physical strengths. And they learn that in all these games that they play. It's very important, because imagine in human society that you would have a man in the house who doesn't know that he's much stronger than the woman and much stronger than the children, who has no idea of his physical strengths. That would be a terrible situation. It would be potentially a very dangerous situation. And so men need to learn certain things about their physical strengths.
Are humans more like bonobos or chimps? So in terms of sexual ethics, monogamy or polygamy, are we culturally inclined to which mode of sex life as a species? Can we say that?
No, it doesn't really apply. Monogamy doesn't really apply to them. We humans are unique in that we have evolved a nuclear family. The nuclear family means that we have gotten males involved in offspring care. And actually more. If you read the work of Sarah Hardy, the anthropologist, she calls us cooperative breeders, because not just men are involved, the whole community is involved in raising the offspring. So we humans have a different family structure. In the chimpanzee and the bonobo, it's the female's work to raise the offspring. The males do very little. They may protect them sometimes, but they're not going to carry them or feed them, or no, they don't do anything. The males do have caring tendencies in these species, and we can talk about that later, but in practice, they do very little. In humans, men got involved in the care for children. And that's a unique situation in our species. And the nuclear family, most of the time, in most of the places, it's one man, one woman, and children. But of course, we know that there's also many exceptions to that. Sometimes multiple women, sometimes multiple men. There's all sorts of variations, cultural variations on the nuclear family theme. And so whether you ask if monogamy is natural or not, certainly a tie between men and women and caring for offspring is something that is natural to our species, I think. Whether strict monogamy is natural, I'm not sure that we can say that. That's not even true for many of the birds who we call monogamous. We know that there's many exceptions to that too. So strict monogamy is not very much a natural product, I think.
One last question. I would like to know your stance on noble savage concept. It's always been some anthropologists advocate that hunter-gatherers were more peaceful and the war was not very apparent. But many anthropologists criticize this view. What do you think current data suggests on this topic?
Yeah, I've always been fighting with people who say that we are naturally a warrior species, because the evidence for that goes back 12,000 years. So since the agricultural revolution, before the agricultural revolution, we have no evidence for warfare between human groups. It may have existed, but we have no archaeological or fossil evidence for that. So I doubt that it was very common, warfare between human groups, before we had agriculture. And so for people to say, because they often say that, we have always waged war, the human species got so big and so important because we eliminated everybody else. And we are so successful as warriors. And that's also where male bonding comes in and where altruism comes in and so on. I don't know. It's entirely speculative, as far as I know, because we don't have evidence from longer than 12,000 years ago. And the current hunter-gatherers, there are a few that wage war, but that's not a very common pattern. And actually, more typical for them is that they exchange gifts between groups, and that they have networks between groups, and that there's a lot of contact between them, peaceful contact. So I think the violent side of our species has been overestimated, and this is maybe after World War II, this was maybe logical. We got all these people in the 1960s and 70s who said that we were very aggressive. Konrad Lorenz in Austria was one of them. We're very aggressive, we have an aggressive instinct. We are very selfish, we're extremely competitive. They proposed that for the human species, and now we have a different view. And now, if you now read the anthropologists and the economists, they say that the defining characteristic of our species is how cooperative we are. That's what they say now. So, and that's true. We are a very empathic and cooperative species. We can be, at least, under certain circumstances. So I think the view of humans as an aggressive and violent species by nature, I think, has been overblown. That doesn't mean that we see now with the war in Ukraine, we see that warfare comes up again. We have that potential for sure, and it comes out under certain circumstances. But I think it's a very one-sided view of the human species that has been promoted. And the funny thing is that the chimpanzee fit with that view. So that's why the chimpanzee became so popular in the circles of anthropologists, is because the chimpanzees also have violence between groups. And it also explains why the bonobo is much less popular, because the bonobo doesn't do much of that. The bonobos, the groups may mix, groups in the wild may meet, and they may groom each other and have sex together and mix with each other. And so the bonobo didn't fit with that entire story. But I think it's a very one-sided story.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the time. This was very interesting and informing. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.